Hello there, I am glad you can make it today. We are in the book of 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 16, and this is a big story. A lot of people know part of the story fairly well, but then there's some parts in there that may be new to some of us. So, what we've got going on at this point is that God has already decided that Saul is not working out as a king for Israel, and he's going to pick somebody else. Well, he talks to Samuel and tells Samuel to go to Bethlehem and find this guy named Jesse, and there Samuel is to have a sacrifice with a cow, and um, he's going to be told at that point which of Jesse's sons will be picked to be the new king. Well, Samuel's a little concerned about this because he's thinking, okay, Saul finds out about this and he's going to have me killed. And God says, no, you don't have to tell everything you're going to do. You just tell him that you're going down there to make the sacrifices. And that is what Samuel does. In fact, he gets to Bethlehem and the leaders of the city come to him and they're kind of nervous and say, okay, what are you doing here? And he says, I'm here to see Jesse. I'm supposed to make a sacrifice to the Lord. And they say, okay. Well, we don't know who all is invited to go to this event. It seems like the guest list was pretty small, but we do know that Jesse was there, and 7 of his sons were there, and Samuel has them get ready for the sacrifice, and they do that, and we're not sure exactly what all they would do for this sort of thing, but they went through what was customary for them at the time. And Samuel's looking at Jesse's oldest son and says, this guy must be the king. And God says, nope, it's not him. He said, you're looking at what he looks like on the outside. He said, I look at what's on the inside of a person. I look at a person's heart. And now that tells us something, because back when Saul was picked, a lot of people think, oh, it's because he was taller than everybody else and because he looked good as a king. And we find out here that, no, God had chosen Saul the same way. He had looked at Saul's heart, and Saul had the right heart. It's just when Saul got that power, then the bad parts of his character came out and made him ineligible to be the king. But God has pointed out that he's after somebody who's after his own heart, meaning a person who is even more serious about this. Well, Samuel has the horn of oil, and he's going down the line from one son to the next, and they get through all 7 of them, and God hasn't picked one of them. And Samuel's a little bit confused, and he says to Jesse, do you have any more sons? And Jesse goes, well, there's the youngest one. He's off watching the sheep, which is generally the job for the youngest boy in the family, is to take care of the sheep. But this is not an ordinary boy. Well, Samuel says, go send for him and have him come here. And as soon as he shows up, God says, this is the guy. And so Samuel anoints David, the youngest son, the 8th son, as the next king of Israel. Now, because there's already a king in place, it's going to take a while before David is actually able to take on the duties of a king. But as of this point, this is the one God is with, and his spirit goes on to David. Now, it has been taken away from Saul, and Saul, meanwhile, is being tormented by an unclean spirit. And this leads to something kind of interesting in that they find that Saul can be helped out from the torment caused by the unclean spirit by having someone play music for him. And somebody says, oh, I know a guy who can do that. Turns out it's David. And David goes to Saul to play the lyre for him, which I guess is kind of like a harp. And that does help Saul a little bit. Well, David must not do that continually, because it turns out he's back home at the point where the Philistines bring out their army to fight the Israelites. And of course, Saul is the head of the Israelites, and so he's the head of the Israelite army. And he goes out, and there's a valley, and the Philistines are on a hill on one side of the valley, and the Israelites are on a hill on the other side of the valley. And it turns out the Philistines have what you would call an ace in the hole. They have this enormous guy named Goliath. Now, we're talking about somebody who's taller than professional basketball players, and he must have been large as well, because he wore armor that weighed like 125 pounds. He also would wear this helmet. He had a spear, and the tip of the spear weighed 15 pounds, and that's pretty heavy to have something on the end of a stick that you're going to use as a weapon. He had a sword. He had a javelin. Javelin being kind of like a spear, but it's shorter and used for throwing. And he even had armor on his shins. And so, along with the guy who was with him carrying the shield, Goliath was a force to be reckoned with. And he would come out and he would make fun of the Israelites. And he was really poking fun at God, because the army of Israel was a representative of God and his power. And he would come out and say, "Send out your best champion and I'll fight him, and if we lose, you take charge of us. If we win, we take charge of you." Well, we find out later Goliath is lying about that, but that comes along later. Well, the person who should have been in charge at this time for the Israelites would have been Saul. He was bigger than his soldiers, and he had some experience fighting, but he was no match for Goliath, and he knew it. Also, I would even say that his son Jonathan, as good a guy as he was, would not have been a match for Goliath. The whole idea of the story is that there was no one who could fight Goliath and hope to win. Not yet. Well, David's 3 oldest brothers are in the army, and David's father sends David with some food to go to his brothers and to check on how things are going. Well, David gets there. He sees Goliath come out and do this, and he's going, "Who does this guy think he is? He's defying God." See, David is offended, not because this guy is making fun of the Israelites, but because of the way he's treating God. And David just can't have that, because he has always been one to look to God for everything. And he goes to the king and says, "I'll fight this guy." Well, Saul thinks, "Oh, you can't do this. I mean, you're just a boy yourself." And David's too small to wear Saul's armor and carry the sword around. He just trips over that. And Saul's going, "You can't do this." And David said, "But I've kept my father's sheep, and I've killed lions and bears that have come after the sheep." Okay, so maybe this is a guy who can fight. And there's something else going on. David has found out that Saul has a reward for any of the soldiers who will go out and kill Goliath. 1, he will give them a lot of money. 2, he will allow that man to marry his daughter. And 3, he will no longer collect taxes from that man's father. Well, those are 3 great things, and now we see that David may be thinking that, "Oh, this is how I'm going to get to be king. I'll kill Goliath, marry the king's daughter, and then eventually I'll become the king that way." Well, if that's the way he was thinking, he had the right kind of idea, but it's not going to happen that way. What he may not have realized is that once God's decided to anoint you, it really doesn't matter what else goes on. There's nothing that you have to do at that point except continue to follow God and do what he wants. Well, anyway, David sees Goliath come out and offer the challenge, and he heads out after him. And he's got very little with him. Of course, he has his staff, because being a shepherd, he would always have his staff. But his real weapon is a sling. Now, a lot of people say slingshot. They didn't have slingshots back then because they didn't have the stretching material for a slingshot. But they did have a sling, which was a long strip of leather and another long strip of leather tied to a little pouch. And then they would take a rock and put in that and hold it at the other end and swing it around to get it going very fast, and let go of one end of the sling and the rock would fly out extremely fast. Well, that's the weapon David has, and he runs out to meet Goliath. Now, David has carried 5 rocks, and we've heard it said before that he only needed 1 rock. Well, there's a little bit more to that, and I may get to that a little bit later in the story. But David goes out, and Goliath feels insulted. He sees this, what he thinks of as a boy, coming out to fight him, and he's yelling at David and says, "I'm going to kill you and feed you to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Well, David's having none of that. He's not scared at all. He's saying, "You and your army are going to be killed and fed to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Well, Goliath's ready to fight. David's got his sling. He winds it up, gets it going fast, lets go, hits the giant right in the forehead, right in here. So the giant's wearing a helmet, but the helmet doesn't come down far enough, and the rock goes inside the giant's head. He's dead. He falls over. Well, the Philistines are watching this, and they don't know that Goliath is dead. Now, here's the real gross part of it. David had also told Goliath he was going to cut his head off, and David doesn't have a knife. He goes over to where Goliath is, pulls out Goliath's sword, and cuts off Goliath's head with his own sword, and lifts up his head. Well, now the Philistines know that Goliath is dead for sure, and they start running away. Where's this about their promise to serve Israel if Goliath is killed? No, they never meant it. They run away. They're headed back to their cities, and the Israelite army jumps up and they take off after them, and they kill Philistines from there all the way up to the gates of the cities where the Philistines were running. And then they come back and they take the plunder, meaning all of the stuff the Philistines had left behind in their camp. Well, at this point, everything has shifted over, and the Israelites have won. But the thing about the 5 rocks, somebody has said before, David only needed 1. But the rules of that day was, if someone killed your brother, you went after him. And Goliath had 4 brothers. So David was preparing to fight not just Goliath, but Goliath and his brothers as well. Okay, well, that's a high note. I'm going to let you go. Today's tie, I've got this guy as a symbol of Goliath and how scary he would have been to the Israelites. But know this, no matter how scary the enemy is, if God is with you, you do not need to fear. All right, I'm going to let you go, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.